Well, hello there, slashaholics. This is Lisa Wilcox here from A Nightmare on Elm Street 4 and 5, Alice Johnson, and you are listening to the 80s Slasher Librarian. Ciao. Have fun.
Be seen in your dream.
When I want you in my arms, when I want you, and all your charms. Whenever I want you, all I have to do is dream, 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 dream. When I feel blue in the night and I need you to hold me tight. Whenever I want you, all I have to do is dream.
Just remember,
I can make you mine, taste your lips of wine, anytime, night or day. The only trouble is, gee whiz, I'm dreaming my life away. I need you so that I could die. I love you so, and that is why whenever I want you, all I have to do is dream, dream, dream.
did you miss Freddy? Well, just remember, all you have to do is dream.
A Nightmare on Elm Street 5, The Dream Child, the novelization of the film by Joseph Locke. Chapter 10. I promise he won't get to you, Yvonne, Alice said as Yvonne parked her car in front of Alice's house. He got to Mark, but I won't let him get to you. If he's getting in through your baby, Yvonne said as they went up the walk to the front door, how are you going to stop him? I don't know. I'm still putting the pieces together. There's a woman I've been seeing in my dreams, a nun. There's something I'm missing. She opened the front door and they went inside. You worry about staying awake. I'll worry about Freddy. Alice led Yvonne into the living room and they froze because Mr. and Mrs. Jordan were sitting with Alice's dad, staring at her solemnly. Alice smiled and said, "Oh, hi." "Sit down, Alice," Mrs. Jordan said. "We have something to say to you." Alice hesitated, sensing that something was up. She glanced at her father. He looked serious but averted his eyes. "I should be getting home," Yvonne whispered. "Remember what I told you," Alice said. "Stay awake." After Yvonne left, Alice seated herself and faced the Jordans. Mrs. Jordan looked at her with a tight, pinched expression and said prissily, "We'd like to ask you, dear, exactly what you intend to do with your baby." "What I intend to do, Mrs. Jordan?" Alice asked. "Well, you can't very well raise a child on what you make at that diner, can you?" Mrs. Jordan nodded and looked at her husband. He turned away. She said, "I'm afraid we're going to have to ask you for custody of the child." "What? He's my child!" "Yours and Dan's, our grandchild. We have rights here too, you know. In your present condition, Alice, you're hardly a fit mother." "Condition? What condition? I don't have a condition." "We had a call from Dr. Morris. He said you were in his office earlier today, nearly hysterical. He said you were having paranoid delusions, hallucinations." "Wait, you don't understand. You've been through a lot, Alice," Mrs. Jordan said. "But a child's welfare is at stake." "Look," Alice said with equal firmness, "there's no way I'm going to let you take my baby." Mrs. Jordan gave her a small, cold smile. "There's no court in the country that would let you keep the child." Alice stood, shocked that this woman would say such a thing to her. She turned to her dad and asked, "What do you say, Daddy?" He turned to her slowly, frowned, and looked at Mrs. Jordan for a moment, then said very calmly, "Well, I think you'd make a hell of a better mother than this raving bitch." Relieved, Alice stifled a giggle. Mrs. Jordan turned to Alice's dad and snapped, "You have no right to talk to me like that." "But you've got a right to walk in here and talk to my daughter any way you damn well please," he snapped back, standing. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Personally, I'd rather bodily remove you, but I'll control myself and ask you to leave." Glaring at him, Mrs. Jordan stood and said, "You'll hear from our attorneys." She stalked out of the house. Mr. Jordan stood too. I'm sorry, Alice," he said, then turned to her dad. "It's just that our grandchild is all we have left of Dan." "I understand," Mr. Johnson said, slapping Jordan on the back. "Remember, I lost my son too." After Mr. Jordan followed his wife out of the house, Alice's dad turned to her and said ominously, "I swear to God, I've never wanted to drink so badly in all my life." Then he smiled slowly and took her in his arms. Although she was off duty, Yvonne was wearing her uniform as she entered the pharmaceutical room, glancing over her shoulder to make sure no one was watching. Using the key she'd sneaked away from the nurse's desk, she opened the cabinet that held the hospital's narcotics and searched the shelves frantically. When she found what she wanted, a powerful sleeping pill, she grabbed the bottle, shook 2 pills into her hand, replaced it, and closed the cabinet. She left the room and, walking casually, replaced the key on its hook at the nurse's desk. Popping the pills into her mouth, she went to the drinking fountain in the corridor and drank them down, then went to a room that she knew would be empty for the rest of the day. Lying down on the bed, she braced herself for whatever might come and closed her eyes. Alice was sickened by what she saw. She sat in the Springwood Public Library watching as microfilm newspaper articles passed before her on the screen, chronicling the lives and deaths of Fred Krueger's victims. She wasn't sure exactly what she was looking for, but she was certain she'd know it when it came. And it finally did. Killer Krueger's mother dies mysteriously. Alice froze on a photograph of a nun in a white habit, the same nun she'd seen in her waking dream the evening Dan died, and the caption below read, "Sister Mary Helena, Amanda Krueger. Was it suicide?" "Found you, lady," Alice said to herself, attracting a few annoyed glares from the readers around her. She pulled in on the woman in the picture, placed both hands flat on the table before her, and began to concentrate hard, her forehead breaking out with beads of perspiration, as she stared at Amanda Krueger intensely, until the air was sucked away from around her as it had been in Mark's room, and she shot backward, passing through some invisible hole in reality, until she was standing before the same Gothic stone building she'd seen in Springwood Park in her waking dream days, in front of the building in which Alice had watched Fred Krueger's birth. There was no one around, so Alice entered, calling, "Amanda! Amanda Krueger! Sister Mary Helena! Are you here? Hello?" She hurried down a long corridor, determined to find the woman who'd spoken to her, the woman who had frightened Freddy Krueger. The corridor seemed endless, and although she called out again and again, she got no response. She stopped in the corridor, looking all around her, spinning to see "Jacob!" she cried, surprised to see the boy standing a few yards behind her beneath a stone archway. He was not facing her, and did not turn when she spoke. He was looking up at someone else, someone standing out of sight, behind the edge of the archway. Jacob! He turned to her then, as if startled, looking almost guilty, and he staggered suddenly against the archway. Jacob! Alice shouted as she rushed toward him. It was suddenly no longer important that she find Amanda Krueger. Nothing seemed as important as helping that pale little boy. He fell into her arms when she reached him, looking into her eyes wearily. Jacob, are you all right? He was sweating, feverish, and he no longer looked simply pale and ill. His face was definitely different. Jacob's nose was thinner, longer. His mouth seemed smaller. His lips seemed to have taken on a half-hearted sneer. His face had taken a very familiar, frighteningly familiar characteristics. Jacob was beginning to resemble Freddy Krueger. He smiled pathetically, and with a dreamy look in his eyes began to sing, 1, 2, Freddy's coming for you. 3, 4, better lock the door. 5, 6. Alice gasped, listening as Jacob sang on and on, his drunken smile never wavering. Where did you learn that song? She asked breathlessly. My friend taught me. He began singing again. 1, 2, Freddy's coming for you. Alice shook him. Jacob, your friend, who, Jacob? Who is he? What does he look like? Jacob! As the boy went on singing, another voice, a woman's voice, spoke up behind Alice. You know what he looks like. Alice spun around to see Amanda Krueger in her white nun's habit. And you know what he wants, Amanda went on. He wants to make your child his own. Alice nodded, as if she'd known all along. Deep down inside, she was sure she had. How do I stop him? She asked. It may be too late. What do you mean? Your friend Yvonne thinks she can fight your battles for you. Alice stared at her a moment in mute horror. Then, she's fallen asleep? Amanda nodded, looking sad, resigned. Alice turned to Jacob, but he was gone. When she called his name, Amanda whispered, He's losing the battle. Looking at the empty space where Jacob had been only moments ago, Alice whispered, Jacob? Thinking, my son? It takes a mother's love, Amanda said. Alice screamed. How do I stop your son? There isn't much time. Look how ill the child is already. She pointed down the corridor behind Alice, who spun around and gasped as Jacob staggered around a corner and disappeared. Alice tore after him, racing around the corner and down the intersecting corridor, as Jacob rounded still another corner, and another, and another, until Alice rounded a corner, and instead of Jacob, she saw Amanda ahead of her, walking toward another corridor. Wait! Alice called. You have to help me! I can't help you here, Amanda's voice echoed back coldly. Alice doubled her fist and screamed. I'm not going to let him win. I'll stop him with or without you. Amanda disappeared. As Alice stood in the deserted corridor, determination burning in her eyes, she saw the wall ahead of her begin to pulse, change color, throb with veins, grow long vertical lips that opened into glistening pink tunnels. Alice took a deep breath and ran for the opening, picking up speed as she neared the wall and finally plunged between the lips, landing firmly on her feet. In Freddy's boiler room. This isn't good, she thought, as she looked around gasping when she saw Freddy. But she couldn't see all of him. From the chest up he was perfectly visible. But below that there was nothing, as if he were poking his head out of thin air. Around him the air quavered like the surface of a smooth pond being disturbed. Welcome to Freddyland, he quipped. What are you doing, Krueger? What are you doing to my son, to my friends? Where's Yvonne? Freddy's arm appeared suddenly, from nowhere, and his fist was closed tight on a clump of Yvonne's hair, lifting her head from the pool of thin air. Her face and hair were wet, and she shook her head, gasping, as if she'd been held underwater. Then he shoved her back into nothingness. What's the matter, Alice? Freddy growled. Running out of friends again? She tried to control herself, tried not to become emotional. Instead, she held on to her anger and said, "It's not that easy anymore, Krueger." Her forehead creased as she concentrated on Krueger and on her anger, until the invisible vertical pull became a wall of flames that engulfed Freddy. He recoiled with a gut-wrenching scream, and Yvonne tumbled from the nothingness, falling to the floor in a steaming, seared heap. "I came looking for you this time, Krueger," Alice snapped, kneeling beside Yvonne and shaking her. When Yvonne's eyes opened, Alice hissed, "Wake up!" Yvonne was gone in an instant. "This is between you and me," Alice said threateningly.
Why do you think I let her go?
"I know why you want me here, Freddy. I know you need my baby. You're ready for your next turn in the wheel, aren't you?" Some of the sick amusement left Freddy's face and his eyes narrowed. He was looking angrier by the moment. "You want to come back into the real world and kill again, don't you? And you need my baby so you can come back here even stronger. The final turn of the wheel." Freddy's knives were clanging angrily beside him, and he was beginning to snarl. "Well, you're not coming back through Jacob, you son of a bitch!" Freddy's face twisted into a hideous mask of hatred, and he lunged for her. Alice dove aside, kicking up a leg to trip him. Her foot caught his ankle, and Freddy plunged forward, flipping over the edge of the boiler room walkway, but not before he reached out and grabbed her leg, pulling her over with him. Alice screamed as they fell, fighting to maintain her control. "Remember," she told herself, "you are your own dream master." Alice concentrated hard on Greta, mentally clinging to a vivid image of her friend, until they hit the filthy concrete floor below, and Alice broke from a smooth roll to stand on her feet. She smiled triumphantly when she saw that Freddy was trapped in an enormous high chair made of filthy rusted metal. He cried out and raged as he fought to free his arms from the metal tray that crossed his lap. He curled his arms under the tray and heaved, grunting with exertion, the muscle cords in his neck pressing tightly against his skin until the tray began to make weak, cracking sounds, and Alice concentrated hard on Dan, drawing strength from his memory, power from his love, and she felt herself changing, transforming. She fell to her hands and knees, except they weren't hands and knees anymore. Her arms were above her head, stretched out on each side, like handlebars, and her legs curled up tighter and tighter, until they formed a perfectly round circle, a wheel, and another wheel grew from her chest, coming to rest on the concrete, and her engine revved. As Freddy tore the tray away and stood up in the high chair, lifting the tray over his head to throw at Alice, she shot toward him in a streak of gleaming chrome, crashing through the high chair and sending Freddy into the air, flailing helplessly like a rag doll. Alice spun around and faced him when he landed, her engine growling like a wild beast. Freddy crouched, bracing himself for her as Alice shot forward again. At precisely the right moment, Freddy jumped into the air, clambering onto Alice as she sped by. Feeling him clutching her handlebars and straddling her back, Alice began to concentrate again, this time on the asylum, on Freddy's 100 lunatic fathers. She headed straight for a concrete wall with a burst of speed, hitting it and crashing through the concrete easily, landing with a jerk on the floor of the asylum. She squealed to a halt, fell into a roll, and came out of it on her feet, herself once again, as Freddy stood and glanced around at his surroundings, with a look of frightened recognition on his face. Alice found the stairs that led to the door above and climbed them slowly, watching, waiting. They oozed from the shadows, some of them wearing filthy hospital gowns, others only tatters or completely naked. Freddy spun around to flee, but they surrounded him, coming in from all sides, closing in more rapidly as Alice watched from above. Some of them laughed, others growled, and some just made low gurgling sounds as they reached out, and Freddy looked up at Alice and screamed as they fell on him, pulling, ripping, hitting, clawing. She heard the crack of his bones, the tearing of his flesh. "Welcome home, Freddy," she breathed. As the voices of the maniacs rose to unbearable cacophony, Alice turned, walked up the stairs, and stepped into the corridor. closing the heavy iron door behind her. "Mommy, want to meet my new friend?" Alice turned with a gasp and saw Jacob standing in the corridor beside Freddy.
You've learned a few tricks from me, Alice, Freddy said, but you haven't learned them all.
He reached down and took Jacob's hand. Alice started toward him, shouting, "You won't hurt him! You need us both!"
"I've got you both!"
Alice stopped a few yards away and focused on Jacob. She held out her arms and called, "Come on, Jacob, time to go home." Freddy hunkered down and whispered in the boy's ear,
"This is your home."
"Jacob, listen to me. I'm your mother."
"But I'm your friend, and friends are more fun."
Jacob seemed torn, looking from Alice to Freddy and back again. She beckoned him with both hands and called his name again. He finally broke away from Freddy and ran toward her, arms outstretched, but his feet skittered to a halt, and Alice's voice caught in her throat when a man called out from behind Jacob.
"Wait, Jacob!"
The boy stopped and turned, and Alice looked over his shoulder. Dan was walking down the corridor toward Jacob, his smile warm and loving as he said,
"Let's go to your mother."
Jacob hesitated as Dan reached down and took his hand.
"Come on, Jacob."
Alice's heart ached as she watched Dan, wishing he could really be back, to stay, but she knew he wasn't. "Jacob, that's not Dan!" Alice cried. As she spoke, the Dan thing reached for Jacob's face with his right hand, and Alice screamed, "I love you, Jacob!" And Jacob tore away from the man and threw himself toward Alice as razor-sharp claws sprang from the Dan thing's fingers, from Freddy's fingers, and swiped the air inches from Jacob's face as the boy ran for his mother. And Alice stood, her arms open, crying, "Hurry, Jacob, come on! Jacob, come on!" Jacob dove for his mother and slid between her arms, slamming into her torso. And then they were engulfed in a sudden flash of soft glowing light as Jacob merged silently with his mother. Alice felt him pass into her body, and she sucked in a deep breath, opening her eyes and screaming as Freddy leaped toward her, plunging through the aura of white light and passing into her like a knife directly behind Jacob. Alice fell to the floor retching and cried at the top of her lungs, "Amanda!" After her cry finished echoing through the corridor, Alice heard a sound behind her and turned to see Amanda Krueger standing before a large door, the iron door that led to the room full of maniacs. "You were his mother," Alice said, struggling to her feet. "It's time to take him back." "He's an abomination," the nun hissed. "You've got to." Alice swayed with another pain, but this one did not stop. With her hands on her belly, she felt movement inside, powerful, restless movement. She looked down to see her belly growing rapidly, expanding like a balloon being inflated, and all the while there was movement within. She staggered back against the wall and cried, You're caught in the circle with him. You've got to break it. You've got to take him back." Amanda stared at Alice's growing belly for a long moment, then stepped forward with a resignated nod. A spasm of pain knocked Alice to her knees. She looked up at Amanda pleadingly. Amanda leaned forward, placed a gentle hand on Alice's stomach, and said in little more than a breath, "My son, I forgive you." Alice convulsed as something tore away inside her, and a burst of dull light, the color of sickness and death, oozed from her abdomen, flashed, and shot directly into Amanda's, making Amanda stumble backward. Alice stood slowly, and there was a long, silent pause between them, until Amanda fell to her knees and clutched her face as her skin began to shift, to bubble like melted wax, and the skin on her hands began to shrivel and darken. Alice rushed toward her to help, but Amanda cried, "No! Get away from me! Take your son and leave! Save your son!" She paused, grimacing as Amanda's condition became worse. Her nose narrowed and lengthened. Her eyes became sinister, glistening slits. Amanda began to resemble her own monstrous son. Alice turned and dashed down the corridor, stopping a few hundred yards away when she heard a hellish scream from behind her. She turned to look at Amanda, but doors were slamming all the way down the corridor, closing the passage off and separating her from the nun. She turned again and ran on down the corridor. No! She looked down at her stomach. We're going home, Jacob. Chapter 11. Months later, as Alice lay in her hospital room holding her baby, her dad and Yvonne stood beside her bed beaming. He's beautiful, Yvonne whispered. Alice said, just like his dad. Smiling up at her father, she added, and his grandpa. Her dad stroked her cheek and said, you done good, sweetheart. I'm proud of you. And of little Jacob Daniel here. He's going to be a fine boy, a fine young man. You just wait. We'll see to that. Alice's smile faltered as she felt a lump in her throat as she whispered, I just wish everyone could be here, Dan, Greta, Mark. She shook her head slowly. Thank God he's gone. Who? Her dad asked. You know who, Dad. We've talked about him before, Freddy. Alice watched as her dad and Yvonne exchanged a troubled glance. I know, he said, leaning close. You've told me about him, and I believe you, but he's gone now. Like you said. So are my friends. I know, honey, and that's bad, but Freddy's gone. So from now on, let's think of their deaths as accidents. Dan drove into a truck. Greta choked on a piece of fish. Mark's bed collapsed and crushed him at his drawing table. I think maybe it'll make it easier to live with, okay? She nodded hesitantly, knowing he was right. So smile for me, he said. Alice smiled as Jacob Daniel Johnson cooed in her loving arms. Okay, Slashaholics, this has been book number 60 on the channel, A Nightmare on Elm Street 5, The Dream Child by Joseph Locke. Gotta say, this being like the worst Freddy movie in my opinion, like my least favorite, other than the remake, I gotta say, the book differences really made the story better, in my opinion, and I really enjoyed it. Maybe I enjoyed it just because it was so different in places. But it's still not like my favorite of all of them, but I think that the book made it a little more fun. Although we didn't get Super Freddy, and that would have been fun. Again, thank you to patrons Christopher Burns Swanson for playing Dan, and Will Piccolo, for playing Mark. You guys did a great job. Thanks for your patronage, for supporting the channel, and for voicing these characters. And if anybody listening would like to voice characters and audiobooks on the channel, all you got to do is sign up on Patreon at the $10 tier or higher, and you can voice a character anytime you want. But yeah, let's break down the Dream Child real quick, the novelization. A lot of it, well, maybe not a lot, like half of this book was in line with the movie. But what got me were the differences, the different death scenes, the different nightmare scenes, like the pool one, was a lot more interesting in my opinion. The whole thing with Yvonne, it was a lot better than her just like diving in and going through the puddle and all that. It was really cool to see like the diving board changing and stuff. Having the dream with Dan with the truck, like getting picked up by claws and thrown into the boiler. That stuff was pretty damn cool. I gotta admit the Mark death was a little, they kind of dumbed that one down a little bit. It wasn't as cool as the Super Freddy thing and getting shredded into pieces of paper, but this was a shortened version of the novelization. It's only like 80 pages, so I understand that they had to like trim some stuff down from the story, but I think they did a good job keeping most of it intact, especially that ending. That ending was so different from the movie, but in a good way, in my opinion. I really enjoyed the fact that we got more of the Dream Master powers stuff going on in that final fight with Freddy. The whole thing trapping Freddy in the high chair and Alice turning into a goddamn motorcycle, and tearing into him. Putting Freddy in the middle of the 100 Maniacs, his fathers, and them tearing him apart. I mean, I know he popped out of that like right away. That would have been a cool way to end the book, in my opinion. Him getting ripped to pieces instead of the whole thing of the souls inside of him ripping him apart like in the movies. But yeah, I kind of pictured Jacob, the boy, differently in the book than I did in the movie, than what he looks like in the movie. And I just thought the book, even though it was a condensed version, because part 4 and 5 were in the same novelization, the same book, I just feel like it did a good job of carrying the story, keeping all the important stuff in there, and the differences we got really shows me what this movie could have been like if they had a bigger budget. I really think the Greta death played out a lot better in the book. It was more interesting. Micro version of herself was actually stuck in her throat. That was creepy. The whole thing with Yvonne's nightmare at the pool, I thought was a lot better. And the ending, was the way that final fight went down was a lot more intense. So I got to hand it to the author. He did a great job on this. I would love to see the original script for the Dream Child, to actually see the fleshed out version of this story, because he wrote this novelization based on the original script. And this kind of shows us the kind of stuff that had to be cut and taken out for probably budget reasons. The ending is not as conclusive for me, with just the doors slamming and Freddy screaming, as it was in the... the book isn't, the ending in the book isn't as much as like the conclusive ending from the movie. But it was still pretty cool to see Amanda Krueger playing that part of absorbing Freddy back in. But yeah, let me know what you guys thought of the novelization for the Dream Child. I gotta say, as much as I disliked the movie, I really did enjoy the book, and I'm keen to hear what you all thought of the differences from the movie. Is there any differences in the book that I didn't catch or talk about in this discussion, or the discussions I did on the individual chapter uploads? Please let me know your thoughts, what you liked, what you didn't like. And I'll be back very soon with more slasher mayhem here in the 80 Slasher Library. Going to be doing the Texas Chainsaw Massacre novelization of the remake next. Until next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80 Slasher Librarian saying, thanks for listening, be excellent to each other,
Pleasant dreams!
and see you next time.